Writing the Rapids, the show where writers come on the show, give me a list of writers they want to be on the show in the future, and I put that all into a big pool and pick from there to see who gets to be on the show. So if you want to be on the show, if you're a writer, make friends with more writers. The show is brought to you by you. Patreon.com/WTR, like Writing the Rapids. See, that's pretty clever. Patreon donations will help go to offsetting the cost of doing the show, like buying books and paying for web space, and hopefully in the future doing more shows more frequently and paying people for their time and words. My guest this month is Dan Hoyt. He's the author of the Deathbed Editions from Octopus Books and several poetry chapbooks, including the Terraformers from Third Man Books and The Tree from Solar Luxuriance. His collaboration with Mike Kleine, We Are the World, was featured in the 2019 Spring Thing Festival of Interactive Fiction, and his collection The Terraformers was the recipient of an Elgin Award by the Science Fiction and Fantasy Poetry Association. His work has also been featured in the Best American Nonrequired Reading, Triple Canopy, Novembre, Elderly, and other magazines and anthologies. He currently lives in Nashville. So without further ado, let's get right into it. After reading your chapbooks that I was able to get a hold of and Deathbed Editions, I'm sort of wondering what you might call your poetry, because there's a lot of like fragments and short poems, and I don't know if I want to call it micro poetry because that has like weird implications in my mind. So how would you describe it?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think for about 10 years or so, I've been writing mostly what I would call a more minimalist aesthetic. But I tend not to write poems, like individual poems. I tend to kind of write collections where I'll think of a concept or a book. Usually it's an object. I think of an object that I want to exist, and sometimes it'll have a title and maybe a theme or some kind of format. And then I'll start working on that with a goal in mind and basically plugging in content. And the format I've used a lot, not for everything, but a lot of my stuff is where there'll be a collection where it's a bunch of untitled fragments that are assembled together into a larger whole. And the idea is that I like where the fragment itself is its own thing. So it kind of functions in and of itself, but then it also functions as a piece, as part of a larger whole. And for whatever reason, that's what I fell into. I had originally started trying to write titles for all the fragments, and then it just wasn't right. It didn't feel right. So I like the idea of somebody being able to flip around, land on something, and that might be the only thing they read, or to the kind of narrative momentum that it gets when it's part of a whole. So it's a more minimalist aesthetic, and it tends to be very aphoristic, these kind of declarative aphorisms, and I'm not sure exactly what my influences were for that, but it's definitely some kind of intersection of, something you might see in advertising or in philosophy or like mysticism, these very short statements that have, they feel like they've got the power of truth to them, whether or not that's true. But that tends to be what I gravitate toward. And the original genesis of that was I was writing very maximalist poems at some point in my 20s, and I had this sort of realization where I was editing stuff, and I realized, I feel like cutting everything but the last line. Like I noticed this in a lot of people's poems, actually, where there'd be this poem that's kind of okay, and there's all this build up, and then it builds up to this amazing last line. And so I was like, well, what if we just cut everything but the last line? And so that's kind of what I was doing. And what I've kind of done since then, I tend to take more of a sculptural approach to poetry where I'm hacking at it and cutting it down to where it's just what you need. And then, and I've found that I don't need a lot of other stuff. So I do that on the micro level for each individual fragment or poem, and then figuring out how to assemble those together in something that has more of a fluidity and a momentum to it.
Okay. One of the first things I noticed when I got to the bloodwork section of Deathbed Editions was how large the book is.
Yeah.
Like there's an awful lot of white space, which is interesting in 2019 where people aren't reading books with paper and ecological things. And did you have anything to do with the format of Deathbed Editions, or is this just how they put out their books?
We talked about it a little bit, and I can't remember why we settled on that particular size or the dimensions of it. But I like something that's a little bit more square, and usually smaller format is typically what I like to do, just because it's more portable. But there is something about the heft of it that I kind of like it's like a brick in your hands. And so, they came at me with that dimension, and I was like, that's fine. And then, I think it works well. The white space is a thing, like that's part of these poems, I feel. They rely on that in kind of like a canvas or a wall that a painting is hung on. Like that's kind of how these poems function to me. They have somewhat of a graphical element to them. Not really, but in the sense that you quickly glance at it and you take it in a second, as opposed to something that takes a few minutes to absorb. And yeah, but yeah, so like I had done a book called Glory Hole a while back. It was a collaborative book I did with this poet, John Leon. His section was called Hot Tub and mine was called Glory Hole. And it was this flip book where you just turn it over and one side is his poems and one side mine. And that one we settled on more of a small format, square kind of look to it. And I've kind of done that with some of my chapbooks. But yeah, Deathbed Editions originally was 3 different books, and I had sent it to Octopus because I was working on them all 3 simultaneously over several years, and finally was like, okay, these are ready to go. So I sent them to Octopus thinking they might take one of them. And Zach Schomburg, the main editor there, came back and suggested, what if we did, he wanted to do something more ambitious. And he's like, what if we did all 3 of these as like a trilogy that's all part of one thing? And I was excited by that idea. And so I spent another year editing them, knowing that they would be together. So there was like some redundancies and things like that I noticed. So yeah, but thinking of them as a cohesive whole was a whole nother round of editing. And then I liked the idea of it being kind of massive and ambitious. And I think maybe that might have informed the size a bit, just to be aligned with that.
No, I like it. It's certainly like very obviously different than any of the other poetry books I have on my bookshelf, which, for full disclosure, I do not read too much poetry, more just out of lack of education than lack of interest.
Yeah.
But like every other poetry book I have is kind of like the exact same shape and length and size. And there's something interesting about poetry to me as sort of an outsider looking in on it, where there's the poetry that is academic, and then there's the poetry that's very young and hip, your Instagram poetries and like the alt-lit stuff from a couple years ago, and they seem to be at odds with each other. And yours almost made me think more of like haiku than anything else, like Buddhist poetry, like that sort of koan-esque sort of thing.
Yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to turn that into a question, but you were already going.
Yeah, it felt like one of those questions that's not a question. It's interesting. When I first started reading poetry, or seriously, kind of really clicking with it, was in my early 20s. I'd been writing before then, but kind of just doing my own thing. But I remember that Sufi poet Rumi, who's like a popular new age poet, definitely not something hip, but that was the first one I really connected with, where I could see what he was doing, and the poems I was most attracted to were these very short things that would have this very startling direct address where he almost would flip the script on you, and kind of these epiphanal moments. And so I can think of like a similar comparison, more mainstream poetry would be, I think it's a Rilke poem, where at the very end of it, he's like, suddenly says, you must change your life. And Rumi has a lot of stuff like that I was really attracted to. And I've been drawn to more like, I don't know, mystical literature, or like, ceremonial magic texts, or like Gnostic scripture, things like that, or, various other traditions. So that's kind of the thing that I'm most attracted to. And, like, I'm not writing like what you might call like a secular type poetry, even though it has those kind of elements and kind of plays with that. But yeah, so that is kind of what I'm into, is something that might be more of like an oracle type feel or a prophet type feel. Those are kind of things that I respond to for whatever reason. And so that's kind of the thing that I'm drawn to when I'm writing. And even when I'm writing stuff that's not as minimalist, like in Deathbed Editions, that opening section's these kind of prose poems, and it's more of like this jocular narrator, kind of moving along, and these vectors of privilege and things like that. And even with that, there's these moments of what I would call like infinitude piercing through, that like web of action. And those are kind of, to me, the moments that my poetry orbits around and wants to produce.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. There were a lot of kind of fragments that I've read that felt very like proscriptive, sort of like almost like revolutionary.
Yeah.
There's a lot of the stuff that stuck out to me. I mean, that's like the nonfiction that I'm reading right now is a lot of like of the old revolutionary type people who, were calling for guillotines and whatnot. So that's sort of like all the room that there is for me to put my own stuff into what I'm reading, and something that has like that much literal space on the page is sort of where I went.
Yeah, I'm interested in, to that point, kind of like revolt, and because it's very similar to the thing I was just mentioning about these sort of mystical epiphanies, or I think of like the the biblical story of Paul on the road to Damascus, right? He's blinded by the dust and light or whatever it is, and it changes his whole life at that point. But having that kind of encounter, where everything's turned upside down or upheaved, and whether that's political revolt in the moment, just a total rejection of whatever system, unnatural system is in play, or whether it's more of a internal kind of revolt that's happening. Those kind of movements are things that interest me, and I think that if poetry has some kind of political function, like that would be it, right? Like it's not going to do anything in the sense of changing some kind of system of government, but it can catalyze people and inspire them in ways to not tolerate certain ways of being.
That makes sense to me too. Another thing that I noticed is that the length of each line, and the amount of like stanzas that you use per fragment, really allows for that sort of like double, triple meaning sort of thing that I notice in poetry. There's a lot of stanzas that almost feel like it's about to be a question, and then there's like a short one-line stanza. Is that an intentional thing?
Yeah, I think the way I use like enjambment and stanza breaks in these types of poems we're talking about, these smaller pieces, like in my mind, it's almost like I'm taking a stick and snapping it over my knee or something like that. And yeah, there's several different reasons why I'll do that. And one of them's like what you're getting at, where there's maybe you're in the middle of a sentence and there's like 1,000 different places it can go. And so snapping it right there when all those possibilities are still in play, and then drop into the next line, and picking one of those, and maybe it's one of them that's a little bit more subverting where you'd expect the line to go. I'll also do it for rhythm or phonetic reasons sometimes, and that's more intuitive, where I'll feel like there needs to be kind of a hesitation or a pause, and not necessarily when I read it out loud, but when the reader is reading it in their mind, I feel like sometimes that sort of hiccup can help unfold the pieces of thought in the way I think is most effective or appropriate. But yeah, I like the dimensionality that poetry specific, because prose doesn't really do this. When you're using line breaks, you can totally start writing something and you're leading the reader down a certain path, and then you snap it in half, drop them to the next line, and suddenly they're like, oh, this is going somewhere completely different. And so just very simple little moments of surprise to keep people engaged and keep the momentum going. And then you get both, you get the original meaning you were kind of leading them toward, the new meaning you've dropped them down, and then the interplay between them. And that, because that also has some kind of semantic content as well. So it's, and a lot of it's intuitive, but that's definitely something going on. And sometimes it's like really overt and maybe ham-fisted, those line breaks, and sometimes they're a little bit more subtle and hard to pick up on what's going on.
Well, that's one of the things that when I had to write poetry for classes in college, I was always drawn to trying to do, but every time I did it, it always felt kind of too cute.
Yep.
And I never really found a way to even like capitalize on the cutesiness of it. Mm-hmm. And one of the blocks for me with poetry, because I enjoy writing things that aren't necessarily narrative. I enjoy writing strings of words for the interplay between the words themselves, which I guess could lead itself to poetry. But I always felt like there was I don't even necessarily know how to describe it, but like too much winking on my part at the reader.
Yeah. No, I think that's a thing. Like when I was talking about the titles and having trouble with it sometimes and just stripping them out, it was kind of that same feeling where I was like, there was just something about it where I was like, I just gotta get rid of this and just play it straight and trust the reader to go along with this. So another good example of that is in Deathbed Editions, that whole last section called Michael Madonna. Mm-hmm. And that was me that was like a concept piece where I'm like, oh, I was realizing like that Michael Jackson and Madonna were born like in the same month and year, and they kind of had a similar rise and peak in terms of their influence in pop culture. And that was, around like 80, I would say like April of 1985, I had to like pinpoint the exact moment when they're kind of both riding high, and then he, of course, had this very precipitous fall, and hers was more gradual. But I was interested in taking them because they both have these kind of mystical names. Like her name means like the mother of God on earth, essentially, and Michael's one of the the archangel's names. So I was like, what if I took their all their singles and treated it kind of this conversation that's happening between them, or a fusion of them, and arranged it in chronological order, and then just wrote these little tiny these poems, these kind of koans or Gnostic conundrum things. But I did it out of lyrics in the songs. So just kind of stripped it down and took pieces out to make this. So I did that. Like I just sat down like a couple days and wrote the original draft of that, which was satisfying for me just because I was kind of engaging with this framework from my formative years in like the early 80s, but redoing it, something that's totally different. But I've had trouble like reading them out loud. And the reason is because it has that kind of winky tone to it. As soon as I say the title, like I'll say like a virgin or something, and then the poem becomes kind of this punchline. It's like dun dun. And so what I've been wanting to do, which I haven't done yet, but I'll probably do this coming up here pretty soon, is instead of me verbalizing the title, I've got it projected behind me. And then I'm allowed to just run right into the poem, and the audience can see the title behind me. So they're taking it in a different sense. And then you just run through it like that, where the titles are kind of cycling through. And for whatever reason, that addresses that weird feeling I have, that winking feeling, where it becomes something totally different. Because it's no longer like a stand-up comic, like saying the title, and it's like whatever, this like cheap pop song, and then going into the poem, and it's kind of this like one-line joke and that kind of thing. Because I want it to be where this humor is more subtle and more complex. And so, yeah, anyway, so that kind of solved that issue for me, or I'm assuming it would. I haven't actually tried it yet. But to your point, like, that's kind of the thing. Like, that's really, tone is everything in poetry, and trying to figure out how to communicate the tone you want. And the tone, because the tone is the vessel of whatever message is there, right? And sometimes you don't care what the message is. It is whatever the poem wants it to be. But the tone really matters, and that's kind of the challenge. And usually when I like or don't like poetry that I'm reading, it's a question of tone. Like, something I'll just be like, oh, this is a little too this, or a little too that, or like, this is nailing it, or this is a crazy tone I hadn't even thought of. Like that kind of thing. But it's hard, and that just comes with like craft, right? Like, I feel it's like you've got an intuitive sense for it, or you develop it over time, and you run into trouble. Like, I've written things that I've just like thrown away, like entire collections, because I'm like, there's something fundamentally wrong with the tone here, and I couldn't quite figure it out, so I just tossed it, you know.
I understand that. I have a poetry graveyard around here somewhere.
Yeah.
How fast do you write? That's another thing that always mystifies me with poetry. Like, both reading it and imagining people writing it. Like, I feel like it has to be a lot slower than it seems like it is. And it's an unwritten rule that makes no sense to me, that I've created for myself.
Yeah, people are different. I write pretty slow, or at least I feel I write slow. Like, I remember when I first started with the more minimalist approach, it was that book Glory Hole I mentioned, and at the time it was kind of out of necessity, because I was working just crazy hours. I was living in New York and had this I was working at this marketing agency and was just like, overworked, and so my time to write would be at like midnight to 2 a.m. about that. So it was this kind of very slow, quiet, dark time of night, and I would just work on these little, basically a puzzle. And so the same poem I'd work on for a while, and I mean, you'd see it and you'd be like, why would that take you several days or even weeks sometimes to work on? But because I'd have to kind of sit with it and feel it out. And sometimes you'll feel that there's a hinge that's not quite right. So I'd try something different, just let it sit there for a while and then work on something else. But yeah, I tend to work pretty slow, or I'll work in bursts. And that's another way that'll happen, where it's like, I'll have this, just like a weekend or something, or a week, where I bang out a bunch of stuff and then kind of sit on it, tweak it a bit, feel it out from the inside, and then maybe do another burst later. But I'd like to be more prolific than I am right now. But I mean, it just kind of comes in different cycles, And sometimes you're working on other stuff, right? Like, if you've got other mediums you're working with, or just like other stuff going on in your life that requires your creative energy, it's like that. So there's always something going on. But for writing, I feel like for me, I spend a lot more time on it than you would think, based on what the actual output is. And a lot of it's just me kind of sitting with it and intuitively feeling it out, trying to identify what feels wrong. And then once you do that, like, what's the solution to that? Sometimes I figure it out, sometimes I don't.
Sure. Yeah, I guess that's one of those things where editing is as much of a skill as writing is, right?
Yeah. Like, sometimes I want, I'll be like, man, I really wish I had like another version of me that could just look at this and piece it together. Like, I was working on something the other day just to try it out, just something different, where I was pulling different lines and stuff from some disparate pieces I'd written, and I wanted to assemble that into its own thing and see what it looked like. And I was having a really hard time putting them together, like figuring out the order. And I even printed them out, which I normally don't do. Had them cut out, like all these lines, and was just on the floor assembling them like a puzzle, because I'm trying to get little modules. Like maybe here's 5 lines that I know go together. These are a unit. And then over here, maybe there's another 7 lines that I'm pretty sure go together. And then figuring out how all these little modules assemble. And I just was having the hardest time with it. And I really wanted just another brain to look at it. You know, it's like my brain created all the content, but I really needed somebody else to come and assemble it. And that may be why poetry takes so long, because it's like I need to shift into that other mode. And it's not as simple as just like pulling an emergency brake and doing it. Like it can be really challenging to step out, because to your point, it's more of like an outsider editor viewpoint where you're not emotionally invested in any of the lines. You're not over determining anything. You're like free to cut and add and subtract and move around and that kind of thing.
That exercise almost seems like an old surrealist or Dadaist game, but
yeah.
The way you're describing it is like doing that for the benefit of a more industrial sort of thing, right? Like putting things into modules and units and then affixing them together in ways that make sense for the desired output.
Yeah, because ultimately I want like an object that goes out into the world. And so I guess that is kind of an industrial or production-oriented approach. And that way for several reasons. Like I just find it satisfying for me personally. Like it's like you're engaging with your audience when you do that. It's giving your work. It's kind of like feeling like you're breathing life into it, letting it go out on its own. And there's like there's a positive feedback type cycle to that. Even if people don't like it, just the idea that it goes out and you're actually producing something instead of it just sitting on your laptop or whatever. And also just like creating things that are physical and embodied, since so much of poetry, for me at least, is a disembodied experience. And even a lot of my work life has been like that, and I struggle with that. So to me, I want things to be real. It's like to make like an object is kind of like a miracle, to bring this thing into being, and it's physical and you can touch it, exchange it with people, leave it somewhere for someone to discover, like all that kind of stuff. It just has a different texture to it that I find really appealing. And that's not to say I don't like, stuff that's online and digital, like that has its place too. But there's something special, I think, about producing an object. And like I said, professionally, I worked as a project manager for a long time in digital marketing. And so I have somewhat certain skills that I'm sure bleed into this, where I'm like, okay, I'm going to incrementally go through where I'm conceiving something, I'm kind of sketching it out. Now I'm moving into actually creating the content, and now I'm moving into a distribution strategy, or like what kind of marketing I want to do for it. Because I like to make videos for my books. And so that book I mentioned, Glory Hole, John Leon and I, as far as I know, we were like the first ones to make book trailers for a book. This is like 2004 or 5. And both of us we had kind of a shared pop aesthetic, and really related to certain aspects of each other's work. And part of that very easily bled into we wanted to make book trailers because we were both really into movies and movie trailers as an art form in and of itself. And so sometimes I would conceive of a video first. Like I would have this idea of distilling a book down to its essence in this, somewhat evocative way with music and that kind of thing. And I've had instances where I've thought of that first and actually just made the video and never even wrote the book. Like I just never got around to it, or just, it just didn't come into being. But that's part of it too. Like I like thinking through all these different aspects of the work and the different ways it can kind of interact with people. I'd love to make actually like posters, like a movie poster type thing for a book. I think would be really fun. And this selecting the one line or something that from the book, the work that acts as like a log line for the entire work, I think is really interesting. letting something have that dual function of it being buried in the piece, but also it's extracted and acts as a entryway to the entire work. I really like that kind of thing.
That reminds me a little bit of, there was a time when I was taking a creative writing class in college where we sat down. There were two poets came in, and I can't remember either of their names, but somebody asked them about, like, how do you know when a poem is good or done, or what's your writing process, or some sort of amalgam of that sort of question.
Yeah.
And the guy who was there was an older guy and said, well, my dad was a woodworker, so I approach it like that. Like, I'm crafting a piece of something.
Yeah.
And, like, so I have, like, rules for my craft, and I make sure that it fits those rules, and that's how I know when it's good, like when I've made something good. And it's an interesting thing to have the word craft applied to writing actually be sort of a reflection of an actual, like, making something with your hands sort of thing.
Yeah, and something that has utility, and I think that's the key thing. It's like, but it's very intuitive, right? Like, how do you decide if a poem has utility or not? It has a useful function, a useful value to somebody. But I do think that's right. It's like you might be assembling, like, if let's to use your analogy of, like, the woodworking, you're starting to cut something together. You're not quite sure what you're making yet, but you want it to have function, and maybe it's got some joints or some levers or something, or some dimensionality to it. And for me, I almost don't care, like, what the specific function is, but I do want it to have function. Like, I want it to feel complete. It's a mechanism, like a prism or something, that has these kind of effects on the reader. And so once that's done, then I'm like, okay, this is done. At least at an individual unit level, a poem level. Now, if I'm creating a work, I have like an entire book, I have a similar approach where I'm, putting all these individual complete poems in it. But sometimes I'll see gaps. Like, I'll be like, I'm arranging these this way, and I feel like I need something here for the work as a whole to have the appropriate utility. And so I might write something new to plug in that, like as a joint to connect two pieces. But yeah, I do think that's an apt analogy, and I think probably most everybody works that way, whether they realize it or not.
Yeah, that same professor who brought those poets in always talked about how he hates the way that high school teaches poetry, because you sort of teach it as a riddle to be solved. What did the poet mean when he said that the wind blows like a whatever, what does that mean? And so it's an interesting thing, because one of the things I kind of noticed when I was researching you for this is there's not a lot of you on the internet.
Yeah.
So I got a lot more of me out of your poems than I did of you necessarily.
Yeah.
As opposed to reading like, what's his name? Like Frederick Seidel, I think is his first name.
Yeah.
Who is a super rich guy by birth who kind of hates it. And so, like, you can't help but read his poetry through that lens.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not sure. So I'm aware of that. Like, I'm a little bit more discreet, and I'm not sure why that is. But it plays into. But it seems like it's aligned with my aesthetic anyway. Mm-hmm. Like I don't. So I've experienced a lot of bodily trauma and like medical trauma in my life, but I'm not writing poems that are about like my experience being cut open and stapled back together and things like that, or various other horrifying things I've experienced. But what I am doing is taking that energy, right? Like I'm obviously drawing from that energy sometimes and that fight, right? And that's coming and then transmuting that into things that interest me, because I'm not interested in writing a memoir like that. I mean, maybe I would, but generally speaking, I'm not. But I have all these. So to me, I'm like taking that kind of energy, taking certain things I have interest in, whether it's like aliens or outer space or survivalism or celebrity or mysticism or revolt, all these things that have a certain charge for me, and I'm using those as kind of the material, but the spirit that's infusing that is the spirit of my experiences, right? And so I tend to be a little bit more discreet, but like even on social media and stuff, like Twitter, I avoided for years, even though it's probably a very appropriate format for me, just given that it's kind of, it's character constraints. Mm-hmm. Like most of my poems could probably fit in a tweet. But even that I was trepidatious about. But I really like Twitter now, so I'm on there now. And Instagram was something I only got on recently, I think within the last like 3 or 4 months. And that I've really liked too. I'm like, I just didn't realize like the whole medium of it is really appropriate. Like I'm like, I can make little videos on the fly with text and things like that. This is stuff I do anyway. But so there'll be personal stuff that slips in there. But for the most part, I'm more interested in creating. And people getting to know me, so to speak, through what I'm creating, or if they're inhabiting space with me, like physically, like what it's like to be around me, as opposed to me kind of talking about who I am, if that makes sense.
Sure. I can appreciate that. I envy that a little bit. I wish I could be more mysterious online. Yeah.
Well, there's something to be said for that mystery, right? Like authors who cultivate that kind of air of mystery. I think that's maybe a lost art.
Yeah. Well, it's also, it's a double-edged sword. I remember reading something from like HTML Giant a long time ago. Like I was going through their archives after they had died the first time. Yeah. And somebody brought up a novel written by some guy that seemed really interesting, but I couldn't tell you who the guy is, what the novel's called, or anything like that when it was published, because the guy, like, the thing that I read was an interview with the guy, and he's just basically like, yeah, you're never going to know who I am. I wrote the book, read the book. The book is the book. I don't want any part of me polluting it. And obviously that's a lot more extreme than you, but I also will never be able to find or buy that book unless I come across it by accident. So, but I also appreciate the whole, like, I work in radio and TV, and just like, I'm on the production side, so watching the hosts like dutifully go through and accept friend requests on Facebook and take pictures of the sunrise with the microphone in the frame, like that seems so exhausting. Yeah, it's exhausting. That's exactly right. Like I have a friend, my friend Julia, I hope she doesn't mind me talking about her, but my friend Julia Benchavinga, who's a great poet in LA, I've noticed when she's super prolific, and just her like spirited pessimism, wit, like all that stuff, like when she's feeling down, it's just this energy flows out of her. It's just, and it's crazy. It's like really amazing. And when I'm cycling like that, like I get quiet, withdrawn, like I shut down. And it's like, so it's like everybody's got their different energies. Yeah. But I do find it exhausting, like to be constantly on and think of that. And like you can kind of habitualize it and get good at it where maybe it doesn't require as much energy. But I'm very conscious of the amount of labor involved in that, especially as somebody who's worked in marketing and there's like entire teams devoted to doing this kind of shit. Like, it's like, it's a labor cost to me, and either I'm fine with it, I'm able to produce that and, add that extra dimension to, of being personable, or I'm just not able to do it. I'm not able to summon the energy to do it, And I was anemic for many years, and so struggled with that kind of thing, just being present, having energy. I'm sure that's like, I don't struggle with that issue anymore, but I'm sure that imprinted on me in some ways, Sure. Do you currently have a day job, or are you just doing writing full time? I do have a day job.
so which I like for the most part, as much as you can like a job. So I oversee operations for a plant nursery garden center, and was very thankful to get that gig. Because I fell into the marketing world just kind of on accident, where I had a friend who worked as a copywriter out of grad school, and I needed health insurance, and so I started as an intern, and then just kept doing that. And I found it to be a really dysfunctional industry for the most part. There's high turnover. There's a lot of pressure and things not going right, and you being put in situations you shouldn't be put in. But I learned a lot during that time and was able to survive and do well. But to take those kind of skills, like these, I'm a creative person, right? So I didn't start out with like any kind of discipline and management skills, but it's like I've learned that. So to be able to take that, extract myself from this kind of line of work that I had a very ambivalent relationship with, and to now the core meaning of what I'm doing for work is about bringing people together with plants. And even if it's like people just want an Instagram plant, like something that's like a monstera that looks dope in this concrete planter or something, like I'm fine with that, because I kind of feel like I'm very aware, and this comes out in my poetry, like I'm very aware of the alienating effects of civilization. I don't mean just I mean literally alienating, like it's like we're aliens on this planet, and we're constantly put in weird postures and doing weird things with our time that are not healthy. Our body and time are manipulated and contorted in these weird ways. And like, if you had asked me what's the purpose of human life, or what's our main function, I would say it's to work with plants, because that's our sustenance, right? And so most people don't do that. Some people do it, a little bit, like they've got houseplants or maybe a small garden. But anything I feel that is contributing to that and bringing people back into that way of being in their body, to me is fruitful and meaningful. So literally everything I do there's a lot of annoying things I do there. So it's not like a perfect job, but it's fine, because the core thing that we're orbiting around, to me, is very, very meaningful. So yeah. And so I've learned more about plants since working, because I didn't know anything about it when I started. I started working there just kind of on the side as a register operator. And then eventually, started doing more stuff and bringing my other skills to the table.
That's really cool. I like that. I kind of identify with that struggle a little bit. I'm definitely earlier on the path than you are, but that same sort of working in an industry that's weird. Mm-hmm. There's so many weird things about working at a radio station, working especially for one of the bigger ones, one of the bigger corporations, and at a bigger station in the market, and just the dreadful irony of it all. We're in the communications industry, and how come nobody told us that this is a thing that needs to happen today, before 15 minutes before the show starts, sort of thing.
Yeah, totally.
This is our job, guys. And I mean, I work for a news talk station, and everything on the air after we get done is completely counter what I'm for as a human being. And reconciling with that, and how that impacts your spirit and how you feel, all that kind of stuff. And it's not always like I was able to appreciate certain things, these people I work with, most of them are fine, they're fine human beings. Mm-hmm. And it could be a lot worse, and we're just kind of in this together, and we got to figure out how to get everybody home at a decent hour so they can do whatever the hell it is they want to do with their lives. But yeah, it's hard. It's kind of this poison, and it's not just for me, I spiral, because I'll be it's the industry and the apparatus that industry is, and it being a conduit of certain, ideological forces and things like that. And then,
and then you think larger and, oh, it's just this piece. And then, I start thinking like, man, it's this entire world is this poison. And that definitely obviously comes through in my poetry, is, sort of this condemnation at times of, what human beings have done to themselves, I guess. But like for me, the big dichotomy is world versus earth, and earth kind of representing just like how we are, like if we're just a creature on this planet, and world being kind of the layer, the control layer that's superimposed on that manipulates things, that misallocates resources and does all sorts of fucked up things that makes everybody feel the way they feel. It's hard. It's hard going through, I would say that most people probably have that kind of ambivalent or just negative relationship with the place that they spend the majority of their waking life,
Absolutely. Well, that reminds me, as I was like flipping through, you did have a fragment in Deathbed Editions that ends with the earth is where we bury our dead. So that's an interesting thing. Cool. I'm making connections. That's good.
Yeah. And I think the big line was, the world is the end of the world. Mm-hmm. Like this idea, like the world, not the earth, right? But like the world is like this governing structure. It's like, it's already ended, or it's already ending, it's an ending force.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a good time to pivot to the Terraformers.
Yeah.
I read it this morning because you sent it to me in a PDF. And I had read Mike Kleine's review on Goodreads a couple days ago.
Yeah.
And there's a lot packed into this chapbook. There's the page numbers, which is the little astronaut head, and there's the planet with the little dot moving around it, which could be a lot of things, and the illustrations, and I found the font that is used to be really interesting too.
Yeah, I worked with Third Man Books on that. So Third Man Books, I'm a big fan of. They're based in Nashville, relatively young press. I would say less than 5 years old. And they birthed out of Third Man Records, which is Jack White's label. So there's some muscle, so to speak, behind it, which is a different experience for me. Like they've got an in-house design team, and they've got this crazy facility that's kind of like, I'm sure I'm not the first to make this comparison, but kind of has like a Willy Wonka type feel to it, where there's a venue space, there's a record store, there's this back end kind of storage space and office space, and all of it is infused with Jack White's kind of aesthetic, which is very detailed, or fascist, depending on your point of view. but I have a lot of respect for him, actually, after sort of learning more about him. But it's great. So I came to, my friend Chet Weiss runs Third Man Books, and I knew he was into sci-fi, and I knew that they had started publishing chapbooks. They had put out my friend Siona Rouse's book, Vanta Black, which is a great chapbook. And I asked him, I was like, hey, I wrote this thing. I've been sitting on it for like 2 years. It's a sci-fi poetry chapbook. Would you be interested? And he was like, of course. So I sent it to him. He liked it. And then he came back and he was like, what if we made it illustrated? And I was like, great, perfect. I am like, awesome. And then he came back and he said, what if we made it a flip book? Where we've got these little animations in the corners. And I was like, fantastic. I've always wanted a flip book, never had one. Let's go for it. So I really liked their creative shop. So they're coming to you with ideas. They want to make cool objects. I really appreciated that. And so for the illustrations, I gave them input. They asked, so like it's almost like I'm giving them creative direction. So I picked a few poems, and I was like, here's kind of my idea of an illustration that could be paired with it, and then pass that on to this designer Tristan McNatt, who's great, who works there. And he came back with illustrations. Now I was like, these are perfect. It's like he's nailed it right away. And we kind of concepted from there. And like we had made a flyer first before we'd gotten into the book. I think it's because we'd agreed to do this at AWP, like right before we were heading to the big writers conference. And so Chet wanted to promote it, even though we literally just agreed to do it. And so that was like the first one where I gave them, I was like, oh, I want this like, a mega shaped hoof symbol kind of half buried in this Mars-like landscape. And there's like whatever, like moon or something in the background. And like Tristan illustrated this thing, and his style was just perfect. It was like kind of this retro, sci-fi retro style that really nailed it. And so we just made like a flyer to start, and then took that and then built out the rest of the book kind of similarly. But what was really interesting to me about that process is we had a moment where Chet was reading through it with the illustrations, and he came to me and he was like, I'm noticing something weird and I want to talk to you about it. And he was commenting on the fact that my poems, like this minimalist style I do, they really rely on white space and this certain quiet mode, to where the words kind of resonate there. And that's a big part of how they're effective. And he was noticing that with the illustrations that was removed somewhat, and it's a different experience of intaking the work. And he was worried that it was detracting from it. And I told him, I was basically like, look, I have like dozens of chapbooks, or however many, right? But I've written a lot of chapbooks that have no illustrations. I haven't written any that have illustrations, so I'm totally down to let this one live this way, And in the back of my mind, I'm like, eventually I'm going to put this as part of a larger manuscript anyway, so I'll give it life again somewhere. So let's just do this. Let's just focus on making a really unique object that, there's not very, I don't know if there's any poetry, sci-fi illustrated flipbook, chapbook that exists, but now there is. So I'm really excited about that.
Yeah, I mean, that seems to be the most niche market that you could get.
Yeah.
But I like it. I've had John Treffery on this show, and the whole like book as object thing definitely comes through in your work too. We're running low on time, so let's
Sure.
pivot to We Are the World that you did with Mike Kleine, who's also been on the show, and I'm very excited about that whole thing.
Yeah, I'm a fan of Mike's in addition to a collaborator. Like, he had reached out to me a few years ago. I didn't know who he was. He reached out to me just because he'd seen some of my work and wanted to swap books. And so we did that. I loved, the books that he'd sent to me. And then a couple of years after that, he reached out again, and was interested in doing a collaboration. He said, he wanted to do collaborations in general and wanted to gauge my interest in it. And I was like, great. Because at that point, I was kind of not being productive. It was when I was writing things and throwing them away. So I really wanted to get out of my own patterns anyway. And I liked collaborating in general, and I was missing it because I wasn't doing anything like that at the time. So we just opened a Google Doc and started, and we laid kind of the ground rules, which weren't really rules. It was just both of us agreed, because we just had a similar approach where we're like, we don't care if what we write is good or bad. We just care about the process and being creative and making something that neither one of us would have made on our own. And so since we were both on the same page like that, it was very, very easy. Because there can be two people who get along aesthetically, but they just can't collaborate. It just doesn't work. But he and I have, I feel, a really good collaborative working relationship. And so we started writing back and forth, just these kind of stanzas, didn't really know what we were doing. And then he eventually went in. We kind of paused at some point. I think I was busy with work, and so wasn't really doing as much. And he went through and reshaped the narrative to be this detective, mystery, thriller, occult thing. And I was into it, and then we wrote the rest of it that way. So we wrote an entire novella together that we're still kind of shopping around, called Where the Sky Meets the Ocean and the Air Tastes Like Metal and the Birds Don't Make a Sound. So this is a long title, which I also liked because I don't normally have long titles, So I would say that one was kind of 70 to 80% Mike, I feel, because it was me really melding with him, and I wanted to get out of my own shit and let him drive. And so it was a great experience. And he's very prolific and easy to work with. So we'd written that, which is a really satisfying experience. And then I got this idea for another one where I wanted to do We Are the World. So it just kind of hit me where I was like, I want to take this song, this weird benefit single from 1985 that was kind of this cultural milestone in the middle of the 80s that was like a phenomenon, like sold, I don't know, it's like one of the top 10 selling singles of all time. And I think always when I think of it, I think of there's this Genesis video for Land of Confusion that's all like these Muppet kind of, yeah. And it's really disturbing kind of feeling, right? It's like Ronald Reagan running around and there's like nukes going off and he's wearing a Superman costume. It's just weird. It's very grotesque. But there's a whole sequence where you see all these kind of grotesque Muppet faces of people singing We Are the World. And so that's what I think of when I think of it. So I wanted to do it, to write about the making of it, but do it as a horror story, more or less, and then have each chapter, or whatever you want to call it, prose poem, be named after one of the main participants. So there's about 20-something soloists and then 40 people participating all together. So the rest of them are just like the chorus, right? Like the Pointer Sisters are there. Huey Lewis and the News is there. Huey has his little, solo, but the News don't, right? Mm-hmm. So there's a few people involved. And so I wanted to do it where there'd be, a chapter for each one. So like Lionel Richie's first, and it'd be in the order in which their lines appear, and then end with the chorus. So I laid it out for Mike, because I was like, Mike, I really would like to collaborate with you, because I think the feeling I'm going for is something you'd be really good at, kind of this carnivalesque type mode where there's all these characters, because I feel really good with names and characters and just having things happen. And so I sent it to him, and I think I even wrote like some spec. Like I wrote a couple of them just to give him a sense of what I was thinking. And he wrote back and he's like, awesome idea. Love to participate. He said, I hope he's okay with me saying this. He was like, to be honest, I don't know who half these people are, because he was much younger than I am. So it was funny to me, that kind of generational gap. But I was like, it doesn't matter, because when he writes anyway, like the name is just a name. Like it doesn't really matter. Like, and I was just do it like you normally do it. Like take, Kim Carnes and just, you don't need to read about her. Like you can if you want, but just use the name, whatever the name makes you think of, do that, And so we agreed we wouldn't worry about whether it was in first person or third person or second person. And it doesn't matter. It doesn't have to be narratively consistent. Like you could have a character doing something in the Billy Joel like chapter, and then he appears later in the Huey Lewis chapter doing something totally different, and that's fine. And it doesn't really matter, and then we'd wrap it all up in the chorus. But yeah, I had kind of this idea of like Quincy Jones orchestrating all this, and he had made Thriller as kind of his initial occult testing ground on using melody to like cast spells on people, because Michael Jackson's Thriller was also a huge phenomenon, like the biggest album of all time when it was out, and that was his like running up. And then We Are the World would be him trying to craft a melody and then summon the collective spirit or all these pop stars, and then maybe open some portal to another dimension or something. I don't know. It wasn't quite clear, but some kind of nefarious aims of his, or somebody pretending to be him, right? That's kind of when we wrote it becomes clear that maybe Quincy's not Quincy. He's just like a demon wrapped in his skin or something. But yeah, so we went back and forth and did that, and it was a lot of fun. Like we took turns writing it, like writing chapters, and didn't do much editing of each other's work, which we did in the first novella. That was the most satisfying part for me, when we wrote an initial rough draft, and then we're editing our own pieces that we wrote, and then we started editing each other's, which is super fun, because it was like I would try to do something and be like, are you okay if I do this? And he'd be like, yeah, go for it. And then vice versa. So it was really fun. This one I think was more us just writing each chapter by our own, and then maybe doing some subtle changes. But we were wrapping it up. And then so this is in March of this year, and he said, he reached out and he was like, hey, there's this interactive fiction festival happening online called Spring Thing. And what if we took this We Are the World and we recrafted it to be an online interactive thing. So kind of like choose your own adventure style, where there's certain choices you make that determine the narrative. And I was super excited about that. And I don't know anything about coding, but Mike does. So basically we had a month, we had 30 days to redo this narrative. And so I would every night would work on taking a chapter and splitting it into units, and then making these choices happen. And there's, different things that happen based on the choices. And then I would send it to him and he would code it, send it back to me. I would do QA on it just to check for bugs and stuff. And then we kind of race to the finish line like that. So it's not perfect. Like, we definitely want to do a version 2 and maybe craft this whole meta narrative around it and fix all the bugs and change things up. But it was really satisfying and a fun experience. And so, yeah, people can play that online now. So it's on the festival. It won an audience award for most bizarre, which we appreciated. We're like, great, perfect. That's a great award to get. But yeah, so that was the most recent thing that I've done, which was really exciting. Also, like we were talking about my more minimalist style, like this is very maximalist and me trying to channel Mike's energy, but in my own way. And that was really satisfying to me. Like, I normally don't think of myself as having influences, but when I collaborate, I definitely try to meld with the energy of whoever I'm working with. Because it's fun, and you get outside your own stuff and you create stuff that's surprising. Like, even now when I go back and look at it, like I was testing it the other day to see how it was working when you click on different things, and there were lines I was coming across that I just had no recollection of writing, and they were very surprising to me and exciting.
Oh, that feels so good when that happens.
Yeah.
I love that. All right, I'll give you the last word, and then we'll get into the reading portion of this show.
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess on that end, I'd encourage people to go to springthing.net. That's the festival, and not just check out ours. There's a lot of there's maybe 15 or 20 different entries that were in there, and just get a feel for what that's like. Interactive fiction. There's a lot of people doing interesting stuff. But I think play/read We Are the World. I think people get a kick out of it.
Good. Anywhere you want people to find you or your other work?
That is a good question. I've got a website that's kind of dormant. It's up to date in terms of stuff I'm doing, but that's thepinupstakes.com. You'll find videos that I do there, links to some work, some various articles I've written. So that's kind of a good one-stop shop to get some backgrounds. I haven't looked at it in a long time, so there may be stuff on there that I might take down, but it's a good place. And then otherwise I'm on Instagram as Deathbedding, and Twitter. I forget my handle on Twitter, but you just search for Dan White and you'll find me. Yeah, so this is interactive. So I think the way we'll do this, and I've done this live 3 or 4 times. I just did it the other day, which was fun. So basically, I'll prompt you on occasion to choose between 2 words, and then whatever word you choose, that'll then determine the next paragraph that I read, and we'll take it from there. So this is Billy Joel, and the first, right off the bat, we're choosing between normal or light.
Let's go with light.
Okay. The light pollution is a thing. Billy Joel wants to know which god name you use facing west at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday in the Northern Hemisphere in January. He turns to Eddie Murphy and says, I don't really know how to snap necks, so I'm just sawing off heads. Is this right? But there is no Eddie Murphy. Purple or diatribe?
Purple.
Sky like purple sequins. The faint echo of Frida's I know there's something going on rumbling through the valley. Billy Joel adjusts the pouches lining his utility belt. He tosses a fistful of cinnamon and turmeric to form a billowing, burnt orange cloud. He says, every question is a shipwreck. The cloud responds, every answer is a mutiny. The mob rule at the end of his mind cuts the rope. Choice or cicada?
Cicada.
Cicada-crusted tree trunks. Billy Joel is roaming the forest with a thermal headset and a machete. He stumbles through a blue mindscape toward obscure splotches of yellowy flocks. Later, he's draining rabbit blood into a vat of fatty remains. There's a scent in the air of off-brand flatulence. The vat overflows. Billy Joel wrings out the last rabbit carcass and says something Aramaic sounding. He's improvising. Private or rumor?
Private.
His eyes are the entrance to a very private club. The sanctuary is in flames. Billy Joel circles it, dancing a profane jig. He is sweating so hard right now. His hard hat keeps slipping over his eyes, but this just makes him jig even more profanely. Huey Lewis joins him in a synchronized jig. Kim Carnes joins him and Huey Lewis in a synchronized jig. Kenny Loggins joins him and Huey Lewis and Kim Carnes in a synchronized jig. The night is a white blur of diminishment. All bodies orbit and are orbited. There's vomit spraying from Billy Joel's ecstatic maw. Now he's stabbing at the ground with his face. Basic or potato?
Basic.
Effectively pawning off his most basic emotions, the trees part and the colossal form of Yah Kagurth steps forward. It towers over him. Billy Joel is prostrating. He says, "I must have passage." The form of Yah Kagurth shakes its head. Billy Joel says, "Have I not displayed a penitent physics? Do I not embody the requisite disgrace and acumen? Behold the jig." He gestures at the event horizon formed by the orbit of Huey Lewis and Kim Carnes and Kenny Loggins. He says, "Behold the center from which we've all been spit, its infinite gravity. Home is where oblivion is. Time is the mouth that swallows us."